She stepped off that stagecoach in a dress 2 sizes too big, hair pinned crooked from 3 days of hard travel, and every soul in Iron Ridge stopped what they were doing just to laugh. They laughed at her plain face. They laughed at her worn boots. They laughed at the idea that a woman like that had come all this way to save a dying ranch. Garrett Lawson stood at the edge of the crowd, jaw tight, wishing the earth would swallow him whole. Nobody asked her name. Nobody offered a hand. But while they were busy laughing, Naomi Whitaker was already counting every crack in every fence post and calculating exactly what it would cost to fix them. Like this video and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach from Omaha ran 4 hours late, which gave the people of Iron Ridge plenty of time to gather. It wasn't every day a mail-order bride arrived in town. It was even rarer when that bride was coming to the Lawson place, a ranch so deep in debt that most folks had already started dividing up the land in their heads, deciding quietly among themselves who'd buy which parcel when the bank finally came knocking. Garrett Lawson had been fighting that particular conversation for going on 2 years and losing ground every month. So when word got out that he'd placed an advertisement in a Nebraska paper and received a reply from some woman willing to come west and marry a struggling rancher, the town's reaction was predictable. They thought it was either desperate or funny. Most of them thought it was both. By the time the stagecoach finally rolled down the main road of Iron Ridge, raising a long tail of August dust, there were maybe 30 people standing along the boardwalks and fence rails pretending they had somewhere to be. The blacksmith had stepped outside to check the weather. 2 women from the church auxiliary were suddenly very interested in the dry goods window display. Old Pete Callahan, who ran the feed store and had opinions about everything, sat in his chair in front of his door with a tin cup of coffee going cold in his hand. Garrett stood apart from all of them, closer to the depot post than to the crowd, hat in his hands. He'd driven the wagon in from the ranch that morning, brushed the horse down, worn his cleanest shirt. He wasn't sure what he expected. He'd exchanged 4 letters with a woman named Naomi Whitaker of Lincoln, Nebraska, and those letters had been, he'd read them enough times to know, careful and intelligent and surprisingly direct for a woman writing to a stranger about marriage. She hadn't romanticized it. She hadn't written soft things about destiny or love. She'd asked practical questions about the land, about the debt, about what kind of work the ranch actually needed done. He'd answered honestly because there didn't seem much point in lying to someone who'd find out the truth the moment she arrived. What he hadn't done, what he'd been careful not to do, was form any particular picture of her in his mind. That precaution, it turned out, didn't help him much. The door of the stagecoach swung open and the driver climbed down first, then helped a family of 4 out from the interior. A husband, a wife, 2 small boys, who immediately started running. After them came a traveling salesman Garrett recognized from his last trip through, a round-faced man with 2 large cases. And then, last, a woman stepped down onto the running board and onto the road. She was average height, brown hair that had been pinned up at some point in the journey, but had given up the effort somewhere around the Kansas border, several strands working loose around her face. Her dress was a dark blue wool, practical enough for travel, but it had been made for someone with a broader frame. It hung loose at the shoulders, bunched slightly at the waist, where she'd cinched a belt to compensate. Her boots were worn at the heel. She was carrying a large carpet bag in one hand and a leather satchel strapped across her body, the kind a man might carry for documents. She stood there a moment, getting her footing after days of travel, and looked up at the town. She had a plain face, not unkind, not unpleasant, plain. The kind of face people look at once and then look away from without registering much. The laughter started small. It started with a snort from someone near the feed store, and then a comment Garrett couldn't quite make out, but the tone was unmistakable. And then a woman said something low to her companion, and they both laughed behind their hands. And then it spread the way fire spreads in dry grass, fast and without much effort. Lord have mercy. That's the mail-order bride? Garrett Lawson sent all the way to Nebraska for that? He heard it, every word of it. He stood with his hat in both hands and his jaw clamped shut, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Pure, straight humiliation. Not for himself exactly, or not entirely for himself. He started walking toward her. She hadn't moved. She was still standing where she'd stepped off the coach, carpet bag in her hand, and this was the part he kept coming back to later, turning it over in his mind. She wasn't flushing red. She wasn't looking at the ground. She wasn't doing any of the things a person does when they're being laughed at, and they know it. She was looking at the town, systematically, almost. Her gaze moved along the storefronts, paused on the state of the road, tracked up to the water tower, came back down to the street, like she was taking inventory. "Miss Whitaker," he said when he reached her. She turned and looked at him. Up close her eyes were a clear gray-green, and there was nothing uncertain in them. "Mr. Lawson," she said. "I apologize for the—" He gestured vaguely at everything. Reception. "Don't," she said. Not harshly, just evenly. "I've been traveling 3 days. I'd like to wash up before the wedding if there's time, and if there isn't, I'd still like to wash my hands and face at least." She glanced toward his wagon. "Is that yours?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then let's go." She walked to the wagon without looking at anyone else. He helped her up. She took his hand briefly, efficiently, and then he climbed up himself and shook the reins, and they pulled out of Iron Ridge with the sound of the crowd still buzzing behind them. They drove in silence for almost 10 minutes. The road out to the ranch was rutted from summer dry, lined on either side with scrub grass gone yellow. The mountains were blue and distant in the north. The land looked beautiful if you didn't know how little water was in the wells. "The debt," she said. "What's the exact figure?" He looked at her sideways. "You want to start with that?" "I want to know what I'm working with." He told her. He told her the number the bank had given him last March, and then the number it had climbed to by July, and then what the mortgage payment was every 3 months, and what the ranch was currently earning, which was less than half of what it needed to be. She was quiet while he talked. When he finished, she said, "And the hands?" "How many?" "3. Lester, who's been with the ranch since my father's time. Dale and Roy, younger, hired 2 years ago. They're good workers when there's enough work to keep them honest." "What does the ranch grow besides cattle?" "Just cattle." "Crops?" "Some alfalfa for the herd, no market crops." "Kitchen garden?" "My mother had one. She passed 8 years ago. Nothing's been planted since." She was quiet again, then, "The town back there. What's the name of the boarding house on the north end?" He glanced at her. "Mercer's. Silas Mercer owns it. Also has the supply contract for the railroad crew working the northern line." He paused. "Why?" "Because it looked half empty and the sign had weathered badly." She shifted the satchel on her lap. "A man with a railroad contract whose boarding house runs half empty is a man who isn't managing his business well. That tells you something." Garrett didn't say anything to that. He wasn't sure what to say. They were married that afternoon by a justice of the peace who came out to the ranch, a thin, elderly man named Horace Drum, who'd performed the ceremony at least twice before for similar arrangements, and had the decency not to look like he pitied anyone. Lester, Dale, and Roy stood on the porch as witnesses. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Naomi said the words clearly, without hesitation, without sentiment. Garrett said them the same way. Afterward, Lester, who was 63 and had the weathered patience of a man who'd seen most things, shook her hand and said, "Welcome to Iron Ridge, Mrs. Lawson." "Thank you," she said. "Can you show me the kitchen?" The house had been built by Garrett's grandfather and added onto twice since, which meant it had the particular charm of a structure that had grown by necessity rather than plan. The kitchen was large enough to have been a gathering room before the back addition gave them a separate sitting room, with a long work table, a cast-iron stove, and a pantry that was stocked erratically, the way a household managed by a man who shopped whenever he happened to be in town looked. Naomi opened every cabinet. She checked the dry stores, counted the flour and salt and cornmeal, opened the smokehouse door, and stood for a moment looking at the hanging meat. She went out and looked at the root cellar. She walked the perimeter of the house and found the spot where the kitchen garden had been, which was now a flat patch of dry ground with the ghost of old beds still faintly visible beneath the weeds. She did all this without being asked and without explaining herself, which made Garrett uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite articulate. He was used to the ranch being his problem, his failure, his burden to manage. Having someone else walk through it with clear, assessing eyes felt like being examined. That evening she cooked supper from what was in the pantry, a proper meal, not the fried salt pork and canned beans that had been the regular fare at the ranch table for months. She made a corn cake, a pot of beef stew with root vegetables, and a sauce from some dried apples she found at the back of the pantry shelf. When she put it on the table and the hand sat down, Dale looked at it and then looked at Roy with an expression that was somewhere between gratitude and mild shock. Nobody said much. The food was good, and they were hungry, and that was conversation enough. After supper, while Lester and the younger men drifted out to the bunkhouse, Naomi sat at the kitchen table with the satchel open beside her. She'd taken out a ledger, her own, not the ranch's, and was writing in it. Garrett came in from checking the horses and found her there, pen moving steadily in the lamplight. "The ranch's account books," she said, without looking up. "Where are they?" "I keep them in the office, such as it is." "Can I see them tonight?" "It's late." "I know what time it is." She looked up then. "I'd like to see them tonight." He brought her the ledgers. 3 of them, covering the past 4 years, the record of a slow decline recorded in his own handwriting with the particular neatness of a man who wrote carefully because he was afraid of what the numbers said. He set them on the table beside her, and she pulled the first one open without ceremony. He sat across from her and watched her read. She read slowly, going back twice on certain pages, using her finger to trace rows of figures. She had a small frown, not of confusion, of concentration. Occasionally she made a note in her own ledger. After about 40 minutes she looked up. "Your feed costs are eating you alive," she said. The drought raised them, yes. But even before the drought they were too high. You've been buying from Callahan's feed store. He's the only one in town. He's the only one in town who sells in the quantities you've been buying in. But there's a cooperative in Millhaven, about 40 miles east, that sells by bulk contract. The price per unit is 30% lower. She turned the ledger toward him and pointed. "If you'd been buying from them for the past 3 years, you'd have an extra—" She consulted her notes. "Somewhere close to $400 in reserve right now." Garrett stared at the figures. He'd never heard of the Millhaven Cooperative. He'd never thought to look. He'd been buying from Callahan since his father's time because that was how it was done. "That's one thing," she said. She turned to another page. "Your cattle sales. You sell in the fall to one buyer, Henderson out of Cheyenne. Henderson is reliable, and he knows you're dependent on him, which is why he's been paying you a price that's about 12% below what other ranchers in this territory are getting through competitive bids." She'd done the math already, in her ledger, in neat rows. "You've been selling to one man for 5 years. He's not your friend. He's a buyer who's figured out you have no leverage." The lamp flickered. Outside, a coyote said something distant and mournful to the dark. "You got all this from one evening with the books?" Garrett said. "I got some of this. There's more I'll need to look at." She closed the ledger carefully. "I'm not saying any of this to embarrass you. I'm saying it because if you know where the problems are, you can fix them." He was quiet for a moment. "And you? What are you proposing to do?" She folded her hands on the table. "The kitchen is large. The ranch has a food production capacity that's being completely wasted. You have hands who need feeding at a cattle drive trail that runs within 8 miles of this property, and a railroad crew working the northern line who are currently paying Silas Mercer to board and feed them and who, from what I can see, aren't especially satisfied with that arrangement." Garrett was very still. "You want to, cook for the railroad crew?" "I want a contract to supply prepared meals for the railroad crew for passing cattle drives and for the stage stop trade. And I want to grow enough of our own produce to reduce food costs to almost nothing within 2 seasons. She picked up her pen again. "The kitchen can do it. I can manage it. What I'll need from you is the initial supply cost, modest, and your agreement that this is a legitimate use of ranch resources." He looked at her for a long moment. This woman who'd arrived in a too large dress on a stagecoach that morning and been laughed at by half the town, who'd asked to see the account books before the sheets were even turned down, who was sitting in his kitchen at 9 in the evening with a ledger full of calculations like she'd been planning this for months. Maybe she had been. "You came out here with a plan," he said. "I came out here with an idea. The plan is still forming." She looked at him directly. "You answered my letters honestly. You told me the ranch was failing and why. Most men wouldn't have done that. I respected it. I want to be honest back. I am not going to just cook your supper and wait for the bank to take this place. I'm not built that way. A pause. Is that a problem? He thought about the crowd on the boardwalk. He thought about the laughter. He thought about the way she'd looked at the town. Not wounded, not angry, just watching. No, he said. It's not a problem. She nodded once and looked back down at her ledger. She started in the kitchen the way a general starts a campaign, by understanding the terrain before she moved. The first week, she didn't approach anyone about contracts. She cooked. She cooked 3 full meals a day for the ranch household, and she adjusted the recipes each time, watching what the men ate and what they left, learning what sustained a working body through 16 hours in the sun. She made notes. She figured out how many men a given supply of flour could feed, how long a haunch of beef would last under different preparations, how much fuel the stove required per hour of heavy use. She also, during that first week, drove into Iron Ridge twice. The first trip was to Callahan's feed store, where she bought the minimum necessary and chatted with Pete Callahan just long enough to understand his pricing structure and his temperament, which was exactly as she'd suspected, a man who had a monopoly and knew it. The second trip was to the telegraph office, where she sent 3 messages, one to the Millhaven Cooperative, one to a woman in Cheyenne she'd corresponded with before leaving Nebraska, and one to the office of the railroad company's regional supervisor. She told Garrett about the telegrams when she got home, matter-of-factly, while he was washing up before supper. He stopped with his hand still dripping over the basin. You telegraphed the railroad? I requested a meeting with their provisioning manager. She set her bag down on the kitchen table. The current arrangement through Mercer's boarding house provides room and board for approximately 40 workers. Rooms aren't the problem. There's nowhere else to put them within reasonable distance of the work site. But the meal quality is apparently a persistent complaint, which is why the crew foreman has put in 3 formal requests to the company in the past 6 months asking for an alternative. How do you know about the foreman's requests? I asked. She said it simply. I had a conversation with 2 of the railroad men at the dry goods store on Tuesday. They were fairly forthcoming once they understood I wasn't just being nosy. He looked at her for a moment, then finished drying his hands. And you think the railroad would break a contract with Mercer mid-project? Not break it, supplement it. Room and board is one contract. Meal provisioning can be a separate line item. She opened the pantry and began considering what was available for supper. The railroad doesn't care who feeds their workers as long as the men show up to work and the costs are within budget. I can feed 40 men at a per meal cost that beats what Mercer charges by 20% and still turn a margin that matters. Silas Mercer is not going to like that. No, she agreed, and said nothing else on the subject. The meeting with the railroad's provisioning manager happened 8 days after her arrival. Garrett drove her to it. He sat in the wagon outside the temporary office the railroad company kept in the next town over, while she went in alone, carrying her leather satchel with its careful documentation of costs, quantities, and a proposed weekly menu that she'd spent 4 evenings preparing. She was inside for an hour and 20 minutes. When she came out, her expression was the same as when she'd gone in. Composed, neutral, not giving anything away. She climbed up onto the wagon seat and he looked at her. Well? They want to start the 3rd week of next month, she said. 42 men, 6 days a week. Lunch delivered to the work site, evening meal at the ranch or at a staging point they'll help us establish. He sat with that for a moment. 42 men, 6 days a week. He did the rough math in his head. That would cover the mortgage payment. It would cover the mortgage payment and leave enough to purchase the seeds I need for the kitchen garden and the additional cookware. She settled her satchel on her lap. It's a 3-month contract with an option to extend through the completion of the northern line. That's potentially 11 months. He was quiet for a long moment. The road home stretched out ahead of them, yellow and dusty and familiar. Naomi, he said. Yes. How long, when you answered my advertisement, how long had you been thinking about something like this? She considered the question. I've been thinking about food as a business since I was about 14 and helped my aunt manage a boarding house kitchen in Lincoln for 2 summers. I knew what I could do with a large kitchen and reliable supply. She looked out at the landscape passing by. When your advertisement described a ranch with significant land and underused infrastructure and a location near active trade routes, the railroad line, the cattle trails, I recognized what that could be. if the right person was managing it. You picked my advertisement on purpose. Out of 11, I responded to, yes, yours had the most potential. A pause. That probably sounds cold. It sounds honest. I told you. I try to be. He drove for a while without speaking. The mountains were getting their evening color, that particular blue-going purple that he'd grown up watching and had stopped really seeing somewhere in the years of worry. The others, he said. The 11. Did any of them? 3 wrote back. You were the only one who answered my questions directly instead of trying to make the situation sound better than it was. She looked at him briefly. That mattered. He nodded, and they drove the rest of the way home in a quiet that wasn't entirely uncomfortable. Within 3 weeks, the ranch kitchen had transformed in ways that still caught Garrett off guard when he walked through it. She'd reorganized everything. The work table had become a production surface with a clear system: prep here, staging there, dispatch over there. She'd hired one woman from town, a widow named Clara Beggs, who had 5 children and needed the work badly, and who turned out to have a natural aptitude for the scale of cooking required. She'd put Dale and Roy on a rotation that included kitchen supply runs and delivery logistics alongside their regular ranch duties, which they'd accepted with varying degrees of grace. Roy adapted quickly. Dale sulked for about 4 days, and then, when he tasted the lunch she packed for him to take to the field one afternoon, a proper meal, not hardtack and jerky, came around without any more discussion. Lester watched all of it with the unhurried attention of a man who'd seen new things come and go at this ranch for decades, and who was quietly reserving judgment. The railroad contract kicked in on a Monday. Garrett drove the first delivery himself, following the directions she'd mapped out to the worksite staging area, with a packed wagon and Naomi sitting beside him and Clara riding in the back, keeping the covered pots from shifting on the rough road. The railroad crew foreman was a large, sunburned man named Walsh, who met them at the edge of the worksite with the particular skepticism of a person who'd been promised improvements before. He lifted the cover on the first pot, and a column of steam came up smelling of slow-cooked beef and onion, and herbs that Naomi had been drying since she'd first walked the ranch perimeter and found a wild stand of rosemary along the south fence. Walsh looked at the food. He looked at Naomi. "This comes every day?" he said. 6 days a week, she said. "Sunday is the men's rest day, and it's ours." He called over 2 workers and had them start distributing. Garrett stood by the wagon and watched 40-odd men who were tired and dirty and far from home eat the first decent meal most of them had had since leaving their last rail camp. The sound that went through the crowd was the specific sound of people surprised by something good. Walsh came back after 20 minutes. "How much of this is waste?" he said. "We've had no significant waste in trial runs," she said. "I calibrate portions based on head count. If you give me advance notice of any changes in crew size, I'll adjust." He looked at her for another moment with that same evaluating expression. Then he said, "You know Mercer's going to hear about this." "I expect so. He's got friends in town, on the council." "I expect that too." Walsh nodded slowly. "All right, Mrs. Lawson." He folded his arms. "Let's say your food continues to be what it was today. We're going to have a good working arrangement." On the drive back, Garrett glanced over at her. "Walsh tried to warn you about Mercer." "I know." And she was looking ahead at the road. "Silas Mercer is going to be a problem," she said. "I've known that since the day I arrived. But the way to survive a problem like Mercer isn't to avoid attracting his attention. It's to make sure that when he moves against you, you're standing on solid enough ground that it doesn't matter." She folded her hands in her lap. "We're not there yet, but we're building toward it. And until we get there," she turned and looked at him with those clear gray-green eyes. "We keep cooking," she said. The cattle drive contract came in the 5th week. Naomi had sent a letter to a trail boss she'd learned about through the woman in Cheyenne, a man named Eben Crow, who ran a drive through the territory every spring and every fall, a respected operator who had complained loudly and often that there was nowhere decent to provision his crew in the middle passage of the drive. Crow wrote back in 4 days, which was fast for a man who was currently in the middle of organizing a drive. He was interested. He came through the ranch 3 weeks later, dusty, direct, smelling of cattle and long roads, and sat at the kitchen table while Naomi laid out what she could offer. Provisioning for a drive crew was different from railroad meals. Drive crews were mobile, needed food that traveled, couldn't always stop long enough for a full sit-down meal. She'd thought about this already. She'd developed a line of preserved food, smoked and cured meats, dried provisions, hard-packed cornbread made in flat rounds that traveled without crumbling, pickled vegetables that would last weeks in a trail pack. Crow tasted everything she set in front of him. He ate slowly, methodically, without talking. When he was done, he said, "My men eat better on drive than they eat at home. They work better. You know the difference between a crew that's fed and a crew that's hungry? About 15% productivity," she said, "and significantly fewer errors in judgment." He looked at her. Then he laughed, a short, genuine bark of surprised amusement. "Where'd you get a number like that?" "From your competitor's trail boss. He mentioned it in a letter." Crow's eyes narrowed slightly, then he nodded. "I'll want a spring commitment and a fall commitment. You can supply both?" "We can supply both, and we'll need your commitment in writing 3 weeks before each drive." "That's acceptable." He leaned back in his chair. "Mercer tried to get this contract last year, offered to provision my crew off his boarding house. And food was terrible, and he tried to charge me for lodging I didn't need." Crow picked up his hat from the table. "I don't do business with men who think I'm not paying attention." After he left, Garrett, who'd sat quietly in the corner through most of the meeting, more observer than participant, looked at Naomi across the table. "He's going to tell people about this," he said. "That's the intention." She was already writing in her ledger, recording the conversation, noting the terms, beginning to plan. "The cattle drive circuit gossips worse than any church auxiliary. If Crow's crew eats well this fall, every trail boss on the territory will know about it before spring." He watched her writing for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "The ledger you're always writing in. What is it exactly?" She looked up. "Everything. Every conversation, every cost, every projection. Every person I meet and what they want and what they're afraid of and what they're likely to do." She looked back down and kept writing. "Information is the most valuable thing on a frontier. More valuable than land, more valuable than cattle. Land gets dry. Cattle get sick. Information, if you're careful with it, compounds." He looked at her for a long moment. The lantern light fell across her face, unremarkable and plain, and her hand moving across the page. And for the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach, he felt something shift in his chest. Not romance, not yet, not quite, but something adjacent to respect so solid it almost had a physical weight. "You're going to save this ranch," he said. She didn't look up. "We are," she said quietly, correcting him. "If we're smart about it, Bob." By the end of the second month, Iron Ridge Ranch was feeding over 100 people a day. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single moment when it tipped from a struggling operation to something that hummed. It crept up on them in the accumulated weight of small things. A second hire in the kitchen when Clara's eldest daughter, 16-year-old Mabel, turned out to have her mother's instinct for cooking. A contract with a stage line that ran through the territory and wanted a reliable rest stop for passengers. A standing weekly order from 3 homestead families south of the ranch who were too far from town to shop conveniently and who would ride out Saturday mornings to pick up bread and preserved goods. The ranch hands, Lester, Dale, Roy, felt it in the work. There was more to do, and the pay had become reliable for the first time in over a year. Roy started coming to the kitchen voluntarily on slow afternoons, offering to help with the deliveries because, as he told Dale, it got him out of fence mending. Lester, who had held himself apart from the whole enterprise with the dignity of a man who'd learned not to hope too easily, came to Naomi one morning in the 6th week and told her quietly that he'd heard from a cousin who ran a small operation up near the Wyoming border that there was a herd being sold off cheap because the owner was in health trouble, and if she and Garrett were interested in expanding the cattle side. "Tell me more," she said, and sat down with him at the kitchen table and listened for an hour. She and Garrett talked about the herd opportunity that evening. It was the first time she'd initiated a long conversation with him about something that wasn't purely financial. She asked his opinion, genuinely, about the cattle, about what he thought the pasture could support, about whether Lester's judgment was sound. "Lester's judgment has been sound for 30 years, Garrett said. "He doesn't say things unless he means them." "Then we should look into it." "The cash position is improving faster than I projected. The railroad contract renewed early. Crow sent a letter asking to confirm the fall drive provisioning." She passed him the relevant page of her ledger. "We have room to move on this if we're careful." He read the figures, then he looked up at her and said, "You projected all this when you were doing the initial numbers? Before you even started?" "I projected a range of possible outcomes. This is toward the better end of the range, but it's within what I thought was achievable." She paused. "The town was easier to work with than I expected. Most of them, anyway." His expression shifted slightly at that. "Most." "Mercer's been talking," she said. Not anxiously, plainly, as a fact. "I've heard it second and third hand. He's telling people the railroad arrangement is temporary, that the railroad company didn't know what it was agreeing to, that our food operation is unsanitary." She looked at Garrett steadily. "He's going to be louder before he's quieter. We should be prepared for that." Garrett nodded, slow. "He's not a man who likes being cut out of something he considered his. No." She looked out the window at the dark yard, the bunkhouse light, the familiar outline of the land. "But angry men who feel cut out make mistakes, usually. We stay honest, we stay documented, we keep our contracts clean." She turned back to him. "Our best protection against Silas Mercer is the same thing it's always been." "What's that?" "Being too solid to knock over," she said. Outside, somewhere up in the dark hills, a coyote howled. It was answered after a moment by another. The sound moved across the land and faded, and the ranch was quiet again under the weight of 1,000 stars. Garrett sat with his hands folded on the table and looked at the ledger pages she'd given him, and then at his wife, who had arrived 6 weeks ago in an ill-fitting dress on a late stagecoach and been laughed at by everyone in Iron Ridge. The laughter felt very far away now. He thought about what she'd said, "We are," and how easily and precisely she'd said it, as if it were simply a fact she'd already recorded somewhere in that leather satchel, in that careful handwriting, in the ledger that held everything. He thought he had not understood, not even close, what he'd said yes to when he'd placed that advertisement in a Nebraska paper. He was starting to understand now. The rumor reached Naomi on a Wednesday, carried in by Clara Beggs the way most information came to the ranch. Sideways, wrapped in something else, delivered while hands were busy with other work. Clara was rolling dough for the next morning's bread order when she said it, not looking up, her voice careful in the way of a woman who'd lived in a small town long enough to know that gossip had weight and had to be handled accordingly. "Mrs. Lawson, you hear what they're saying at Callahan's?" Naomi was inventorying the dry stores, pencil moving down her list. "I hear a lot of things." "Which particular ones?" "That the railroad company didn't know you were a woman when they signed the contract." Clara paused. "That when they find out, they'll cancel it." Naomi wrote down the flour count, wrote down the cornmeal count. "Who's saying that?" "Pete Callahan said it to my neighbor's husband, but it didn't start with Pete." Clara kept rolling. "Pete repeats things. He doesn't start them." Naomi closed the inventory book. She already knew where it started. She'd known for 3 weeks that Silas Mercer was talking. She'd felt it in the slight coolness from 2 families who'd been friendly enough before, in the way the dry goods clerk had watched her a beat too long the last time she'd come in. Small things. The kind of small things that accumulated into something larger if you weren't paying attention. She was paying attention. "Thank you for telling me," she said to Clara, and went back to her inventory. That evening she wrote a letter to the railroad company's regional manager. Not a defensive letter. Not a letter that addressed the rumor at all, because addressing a rumor gave it legitimacy it didn't deserve. It was instead a brief professional note enclosing the first month's delivery record. Dates, quantities, headcount, quality complaints received, which were 0, Foreman Walsh's written satisfaction report, which she'd asked him for 2 weeks ago on the intuition she'd need it. She enclosed a proposed extension of terms through the winter months, with a pricing schedule that was modest and documented and impossible to argue with on merit. She sealed it and addressed it and gave it to Roy to take to the telegraph office in the morning, along with 3 other pieces of correspondence. Garrett found her at the table later that night. He'd heard about the rumor from Lester, who'd heard it from Dale, who'd overheard it at the livery stable. "You're not worried," he said. It was not quite a question. "I'm concerned," she said. "There's a difference. Worried is what you feel when you don't have a plan. Concerned is what you feel when you have a plan, but you know the road is going to be rough." He sat down across from her. He developed a habit of sitting with her in the evenings, not always talking, sometimes just present while she worked, occasionally asking questions or offering the particular knowledge of the land and the territory that she didn't have and that he'd grown up carrying in his bones. It had become a kind of rhythm between them, the two of them at that kitchen table in the lamplight, the ranch settling around them for the night. "The railroad manager," Garrett said. "Hollis. You think he'll hold the contract?" "I think Hollis is a practical man who cares about his crew's productivity and his budget, in that order. The food has been good, the costs have been on target, Walsh has had no complaints." She looked up. "What Mercer is betting on is that the company will care about convention, about a woman holding a provisioning contract, more than they care about results. That's a bad bet. Railroad companies are not sentimental. And if he's escalating, trying other angles. He will try other angles." She said it flatly, without drama. "When the rumors don't work, he'll try something harder. Men like Mercer always do." She turned a page in her ledger, "Which is why we need to be further along before he gets there." The further along arrived faster than either of them expected, and from a direction neither had entirely anticipated. It was Mabel, Clara's 16-year-old daughter, who noticed it first. She'd been coming to the ranch kitchen every morning before school during the week and all day Saturday, and she had the particular sharpness of a girl who'd grown up watching her widowed mother stretch every dollar until it was nearly transparent, and who had therefore developed an instinctive alertness to waste and opportunity both. She noticed things. She noticed specifically that the travelers stopping at the stage rest point, which had become a regular operation by then, hot food and clean water, and a shaded place to sit for the 45 minutes the stage company built into the schedule, often lingered past the allotted time. "They don't want to leave," she told Naomi one afternoon, direct as a nail going into wood. Naomi looked up from the stove. "Why not?" "Because it's nice here." Mabel gestured, encompassing the kitchen yard, the shade of the big cottonwood, the rough table and benches Garrett had built at Naomi's request. "It's the first nice place they've been in 3 days. Some of them rode a long way before this, and they've got a long way still to go. One lady today was crying because she missed her mother back in Ohio, and she said sitting here reminded her of—" Mabel stopped. "Well," she said, "it felt like somewhere real." Naomi was quiet for a moment. "You talked to her." She was crying. "I wasn't going to just stand there." Mabel picked up a dish towel with the ease of a girl who'd been helping in kitchens since she could reach a counter. "She asked if we had any rooms." Naomi turned this over in her mind the way she turned over most ideas, quickly from several angles, checking for weaknesses. The ranch house had 2 unused rooms in the east wing, rooms that had stood empty since Garrett's mother passed, and his father went to live with a cousin in Colorado. Garrett used neither of them. They had good windows and the house was solidly built, and they were currently gathering dust. She brought it up at supper. Garrett was across the table, Lester at the far end with his usual quiet, the younger hands already done and gone out. "The east rooms," she said. "Both of them. I want to talk about putting travelers up." Garrett looked at her. "You want to run a boarding house?" "Not a boarding house. 2 rooms. Travelers who need a decent night's rest between stage stops, who are already stopping here for meals." She pushed the salt toward him. "The stage company runs a full circuit. Right now there's a gap between the rest stop here and the next available lodging. That's Mercer's place in Iron Ridge, or a rough camp at the junction. If we offer 2 clean rooms at a fair price, we fill a need that genuinely exists. Mercer will call it direct competition." "It is direct competition, but there's a difference between competing and poaching. We're not going into Iron Ridge and setting up a boarding house next to his." She looked at Garrett steadily. "We're putting 2 rooms to use on our own property for people who are already here." Lester spoke without looking up from his plate. "East wing needs the windows reglazed. South room's got a floorboard needs replacing." "I know," she said. "Can you do it?" "Give me 2 days and the materials." He kept eating. "Roy can help." Garrett looked at his foreman, then at his wife. He had a habit now of being 2 or 3 seconds behind her in these conversations, not because he was slow, she'd understood early on that he was not a slow man, but because she arrived at conclusions through a path he was still learning to follow, and he'd stopped trying to get ahead of her and started trying to keep up. "All right," he said. 2 rooms. She nodded. 2 rooms for now. Lester repaired the floor. Roy helped reglaze the windows without particular complaint, which was his way of indicating approval. Clara sewed 2 sets of curtains from fabric Naomi bought at the dry goods store. Clean, white cotton, simple, nothing fancy, just the suggestion of care and attention that made a room feel like someone had thought about the person sleeping in it. The first paying guests were a couple traveling from Missouri to Oregon, a middle-aged man and his wife who had been on the stage for 11 days, and who looked like 11 days on a stage, looked. The wife, whose name was Martha, came into the kitchen the next morning after the first full night's sleep she'd had since leaving St. Louis, and stood in the doorway for a moment just breathing in the smell of coffee and fresh bread. "This is," she said, and then stopped, because she apparently couldn't finish the sentence. "Sit down," Naomi told her. "Breakfast is in 10 minutes." Martha sat. She ate. She left a note tucked under her payment that said simply, "Thank you for the ordinary miracle of a clean bed and a hot meal." Naomi read it once and then tucked it into the back of her ledger, which was not the sort of thing she typically put in her ledger, but she put it there anyway. It was around this time that Silas Mercer began to be less subtle. He was a large man, Mercer, tall and broad through the shoulders, with the kind of permanent sunburn that came from years of outdoor work before he'd made enough money to stop doing it. He dressed better than most men in Iron Ridge, wore a good hat, kept his establishment's sign freshly painted. He was on the town council and had been for 6 years. He lent money occasionally to people who needed it, at rates that were not quite extortionate but that were not friendly either, and people who borrowed from him had a way of remembering later that they owed him something beyond the interest. He came to the ranch on a Thursday afternoon in late September, unannounced, driving his own buggy. Garrett was out checking fence lines. Naomi was in the kitchen. She heard the buggy come into the yard and went to the door and watched him get down. He was dressed formally for a ranch call. Good coat, clean boots. He walked toward the house with the deliberate ease of a man who thought his presence should be enough to establish an advantage. "Mrs. Lawson," he said. He had a voice calibrated for authority, the kind of voice that had gotten used to rooms listening to it. "Mr. Mercer." She leaned against the doorframe and did not invite him in. "What can I do for you?" He looked around the yard, the organized kitchen garden that had started producing in its first season, the delivery wagon pulled up by the barn, the new timber of the repaired east wing visible on the side of the house. She watched him look at it all and register what it meant. "Quite the operation you've put together," he said. "For someone who's been here, 3 months?" "About that. Impressive." He said the word in a way that wasn't a compliment. "I heard you've taken in overnight guests." "We have 2 rooms we rent to travelers." "Yes." "You know there are regulations about that, health ordinances. The town council has guidelines for establishments offering lodging." "I've read them," she said. "We're in compliance with all of them. I checked with the county office before we opened the rooms." Something moved across his face. Not quite surprise, but the adjustment a person makes when they expected a foothold and didn't find one. "The railroad contract," he said, changing direction smoothly. "That's company business, and companies are known to change their arrangements." "They are," she agreed pleasantly. "Is there something specific you wanted to discuss, Mr. Mercer? Or did you come out here to describe things I already know?" His jaw tightened slightly. He wasn't used to that. To a woman looking at him from a doorway and waiting with that particular quality of patience that had nothing deferential in it. "I've been in this territory for 14 years, he said. "I've built something here. I have relationships with the town, with the council, with the banking institution that holds most of the mortgages on the properties in this valley." He paused, letting that sit. "I'm suggesting to you, as a neighbor, that it would benefit everyone if the enterprises in this area operated with some consideration for one another." "Are you suggesting I should reduce my operation?" "I'm suggesting," he said carefully, "that competition without cooperation tends to end badly for the smaller party." Naomi looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "My husband will be back in about an hour if you'd like to wait and speak to him." "I'm speaking to you." "You are, and I've heard you." She straightened from the doorframe. "I'll pass along your regards. Good afternoon, Mr. Mercer." She went back inside without waiting for him to respond. From the kitchen window, she watched him stand in the yard for a moment, just long enough to register the insult, which was intentional, and then he got back into his buggy and drove away. Clara was at the work table, watching. "That was Silas Mercer," she said. "Yes." "He's not going to let that go." "No," Naomi said. She went back to what she'd been doing. He's not. She told Garrett about the visit that evening. He sat with it for a while before he spoke, turning his hat slowly in his hands. He mentioned the bank. He mentioned the bank. That's not accidental. Danforth at the First Territorial holds our mortgage. Mercer and Danforth have been on the council together for 4 years. Garrett looked up. He's telling you he has a lever. He's telling me he thinks he has a lever. She poured coffee and set a cup in front of him. Which means we have a limited time to make the lever useless. How do you make a bank lever useless? You reduce your debt to the point where the bank has less interest in disrupting you than in keeping you as a reliable customer. She sat down across from him. Our mortgage payment is current. We haven't missed one since I arrived. In 3 months, we've gone from barely covering costs to building a reserve. She pulled her ledger over. If we continue at current trajectory and add the income from the cattle purchase Lester identified, by spring we'll be in a position to approach the bank proactively, not reactively, about restructuring the mortgage at a lower rate. At that point, we're not a distressed account they can pressure. We're a performing account they want to keep. He looked at the figures she was showing him. He was better with them now than he'd been in September. She'd been teaching him, not formally, but by including him, by explaining her reasoning, by asking his opinion, and then showing him how his knowledge of the land and operations fit into the larger financial picture. He was learning to read the ranch the way she read it, in numbers as well as acres. 3 months, he said, give or take. And in that time, Mercer will escalate. She closed the ledger. Count on it. He escalated in October, and he was clever about it. The first thing was a letter to the railroad company's regional office, not from Mercer directly, but from 3 council members, raising questions about the hygiene standards of the Iron Ridge Ranch provisioning operation and requesting an inspection. It was a legitimate procedural mechanism, which was what made it effective. The railroad company couldn't ignore a formal complaint from a municipal council. The inspector came out on a Tuesday morning, a thin, precise man named Abbott, from the company's regional office, who arrived with a clipboard and the expression of someone who expected to find problems and would be disappointed if he didn't. He spent 2 hours in the kitchen. He looked at everything. He checked the water supply, the food storage, the cooking surfaces, the handling procedures, the documentation Naomi kept on every delivery. He did not find anything to cite. He stood in the kitchen doorway at the end of his inspection and looked at his clipboard and then at Naomi with an expression that had shifted over the course of 2 hours from professional skepticism to something closer to reluctant approval. Your documentation is thorough, he said. I keep careful records. Your water source is cleaner than half the establishments I inspect in town. We redug the well last month, new casing. He made a final note. I'll be reporting no violations to the regional office, Mrs. Lawson. The complaint appears to be without foundation. I appreciate your thoroughness, she said. After he left, Garrett, who'd stayed out of sight at Naomi's specific request because she'd wanted to handle it without the complication of male authority, came into the kitchen from the side door. Clean? Clean. She was already writing the outcome into her ledger. Make sure Lester knows so he can pass it to Dale and Roy. I want the hands to know what was attempted and what the result was. It matters for morale. The second thing Mercer tried was quieter and took longer to trace. Naomi became aware of it through the stage company manager, a methodical man named Gus Ferris, who ran the company's regional schedule out of an office in the nearest large town and who'd been a reliable professional contact since the rest stop arrangement began. Ferris came out himself one afternoon, which was unusual enough that she knew before he spoke that something was wrong. I've received a complaint from a passenger, he said, sitting across from her at the kitchen table with his hat on his knee. Anonymous, claiming that the food served at this rest stop made them ill. Naomi looked at him steadily. When? Complaint was dated 3 weeks ago. We have complete meal records for every service date. I can show you what was served on any given day, with quantity and preparation notes. She went to the shelf without being asked and brought back the relevant volume of her food service log. What date are we talking about? Ferris told her. She found the page and turned it toward him. He read through it with the careful attention of a man who understood he was being used as a tool in someone else's conflict and didn't appreciate it. Anonymous, she said. The complaint was anonymous. Yes. In 20 weeks of service, we've had 0 documented illness complaints from the railroad crew. from the cattle drive provisioning, and from stage passengers. Walsh at the railroad has signed off on every monthly review. I have those in writing. She kept her voice level. I understand you have to take formal complaints seriously, Mr. Ferris, but I'd ask you to consider the pattern here. He looked at her for a long moment. He was not a young man. He'd been in this business long enough to have seen what competition could make people do. Mercer, he said. Not a question. I didn't say that. No. He closed the logbook carefully. I've been in this industry 22 years, Mrs. Lawson. I've seen this kind of thing before. He stood and picked up his hat. For the record, my own inspection today found nothing to concern me. The complaint will be noted as unsubstantiated. When he was gone, Naomi sat alone in the kitchen for a few minutes. The fire in the stove was burning down, and the light through the windows was the specific pale gold of late afternoon in October. Somewhere outside, she could hear Roy and Dale working, the steady sound of labor, of the ranch in operation. She wasn't afraid. That was the thing she checked for sometimes, when she sat quietly in a moment like this. Fear, the specific cold water feeling of doubt, the voice that said you've gone too far and it won't hold. She'd heard that voice before back in Nebraska when she'd first started making plans that other people thought were bigger than she was. She didn't hear it now. What she felt instead was something closer to focus. The kind of focus that came from knowing exactly where you were in a fight and what your resources were and what needed doing next. She picked up her pen. November brought the first real cold, and with it two things that changed the ranch's position substantially. The first was the Millhaven cooperative arrangement finally coming through. It had taken 4 months of correspondence and 2 trips to negotiate the terms in person. The second of which she'd made with Garrett, who'd understood by then that being present mattered, and who had, in the course of those negotiations, displayed the particular stubbornness and direct dealing that turned out to be genuinely useful when the cooperative's manager tried to revise the agreed terms upward at the last moment. Garrett had put his hat on the table and said, flatly and without heat, that they'd agreed to a number and he didn't negotiate numbers twice. And the manager had looked at him and then at Naomi's ledger documentation and backed down. On the drive home, Naomi had looked out at the road and said, "That was well done." Garrett had said, "You knew he was going to try it." "I suspected, and you didn't warn me. I wanted to see how you'd handle it." He'd been quiet for a moment and then laughed. A real laugh, the kind she'd only heard a handful of times, that started somewhere in the chest and didn't have any performance in it. She found she liked the sound of it more than she expected. The feed cost reduction took effect immediately, which moved their numbers faster than she'd projected and gave her room to accelerate the mortgage reserve by 6 weeks. The second thing that happened in November was Eben Crow's fall cattle drive, which came through on schedule. 43 men and a trailing herd. Crow himself stepped down from his horse in the yard, shook Naomi's hand, and said without preamble, "My spring crew's going to be bigger, 60, maybe 65. You can handle that?" "Yes," she said, "with 2 weeks' notice." "You'll have it." He looked around the yard. The kitchen operation visible through the open door, the delivery arrangements, the organized system she'd built. "Word on the trail is your food's the reason some of my boys volunteered for this circuit." He said it gruffly, the way men like Crow gave compliments, like they were handing over something that cost them something. That's not nothing. It was not nothing. Word on the trail was exactly how territory commerce moved, and she knew it, and she'd known it since before she'd signed the contract. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed and added the fall drive income to the column and recalculated the full-year position of the ranch. She did it twice to be sure. Then she sat with the number in front of her for a little while. When Garrett came in, he'd taken to checking the horses late, a habit from harder times that persisted even now. He found her at the table with the ledger open and that particular stillness around her that he'd learned to read as something significant. "How does it look?" he said, pouring himself a cup of what was left of the evening coffee. "Better than I projected," she said. "Significantly better." He sat down. "How significantly?" She turned the ledger toward him and put her finger on the number. He looked at it. He looked at it for several seconds without speaking. Then he looked up at her and she saw something in his face that she hadn't seen before. Not gratitude, exactly, though that was there. Something rawer than gratitude. The look of a man who'd been carrying a weight for so long he'd stopped being able to imagine what not carrying it felt like, and who was only now beginning to understand that the weight had shifted. "Naomi," he said. "It's not the end," she said, before he could say whatever he was going to say. "Mercer is still going to come at us harder. The bank review is in January. We're not safe yet." "I know." He was still looking at her, but it's not nothing either. She looked back at the number for a moment, then she said quietly, "No, it's not nothing." Outside the kitchen window, the November dark pressed in close and cold, and the ranch was quiet, all its working parts at rest, the land holding still under the first taste of winter. But inside, the lamp was burning, and the ledger was full of careful numbers, and two people sat across from each other in the warm light of something that had been, against most reasonable odds, built from very nearly nothing. Silas Mercer was still out there, and January was coming, and the hardest part wasn't over yet. But the ranch that everyone in Iron Ridge had been mentally dividing into parcels was still standing, and the woman they'd laughed off a stagecoach 3 months ago had every intention of keeping it that way. The letter from First Territorial Bank arrived on a Thursday morning in the second week of January, and it said, in the precise language of institutional caution, that the bank was requesting a formal review of the Iron Ridge Ranch account prior to the scheduled mortgage renewal in March. Garrett read it at the breakfast table. Then he read it again. "They've never asked for a review before renewal," he said. "In 5 years, they've never done that." Naomi took the letter from him and read it herself. It was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph described the review as routine, a word she'd learned to treat with suspicion. The second paragraph named the date, January 23rd, and the location, the bank's offices in Iron Ridge, and requested the presence of the account holder along with any relevant financial documentation. "Danforth sign it?" she asked. "His name's on it. His secretary probably wrote it." Garrett pushed back from the table and stood up, which was what he did when he was thinking hard and couldn't sit still for it. "Mercer moved faster than you thought." "Faster than I hoped," she said, "not faster than I thought." She folded the letter along its original creases and set it down. "January 23rd is 11 days away. That's enough time." "Enough time for what?" "To be ready." She stood and went to the shelf where her ledgers lived, 3 of them now, fat with 7 months of careful documentation. She pulled the most recent one down and opened it on the table. "Sit down, Garrett. We have work to do." He sat. And for the next 4 hours, while the January cold pressed against the windows, and Clara worked quietly at the far end of the kitchen, pretending not to listen, they went through every number the ranch had generated since August, every contract, every delivery record, every expense, every payment, every projection. Naomi organized it, and Garrett learned it. Not just the figures, but the story the figures told, because she understood that the bank meeting was not going to be won on arithmetic alone. It was going to be won on narrative, on the ability to walk into a room where someone had already decided what they thought and make them reconsider. "You'll need to be able to answer any question they ask without looking at me first," she said at one point. He looked up from the page he'd been studying. "Why?" "Because Danforth is going to speak to you, not to me. I'm the wife. In his mind, I'm the support function, not the operation." She said it without resentment. It was just a fact, a condition of the terrain she was navigating. "If every question gets answered by you referring to me, it confirms whatever Mercer has told him about the ranch being dependent on an unstable arrangement." "You mean dependent on you, on a woman?" She said it plainly. "Which in Danforth's world means dependent on something that could leave, or get sick, or get pregnant, or simply change her mind." She turned another page. "So you need to know this material as well as I do. We walk in there as a working unit, both of us knowing the numbers, and neither of us making the other look necessary." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "You've been thinking about this for a while." "Since October." He looked at her. "Mercer came to the ranch in September." "Yes." "And you started preparing for this bank meeting in October." "I started preparing for the possibility of a bank meeting in October," she said. "I hoped we'd have until spring. We don't." "That's all right. We're not unprepared." He held her gaze for a moment, and there was something in his expression she'd been seeing more of in recent weeks. Not admiration exactly, because admiration had a quality of distance to it. This was something closer. The look of a person who had gotten used to standing next to someone and was starting to understand that they didn't want to stand anywhere else. She looked back down at the ledger. Page 12, she said. Cattle sale projections for spring. Let's go through them again. The night before the meeting, neither of them slept particularly well. Naomi was aware of this because she was lying in the dark at 2 a.m, going through the documentation in her head. Every number, every contract, every counter-argument she might need, when she heard Garrett get up and go out to the kitchen. She waited a few minutes, then got up herself. He was at the table with a cup of cold coffee he wasn't drinking, looking at nothing. She sat down across from him. "Tell me something I don't know about the land," she said. He looked at her. "What?" "The ranch. Tell me something I couldn't have learned from the ledgers, something you know because you grew up here." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "The south pasture floods in March. Not badly, but enough that the ground stays soft through April if you're not careful with where you run the cattle. My father lost 2 animals to bog in a wet March. I've known about it since I was 8. It doesn't show up in any document." "Good. What else?" He looked at her steadily. Then he said, "The well on the east side of the property, the one that went dry in the drought. There's a secondary water table under that land, about 60 feet deeper than the original well. My grandfather knew about it. He drilled a test shaft 40 years ago and hit water, but decided it wasn't worth the cost to go full depth at the time. I found his notes in a box in the attic 3 years ago." She stared at him. "You've known about a secondary water source for 3 years and you didn't drill." "I didn't have the money." "Garrett, that changes the drought risk profile of this ranch completely. That's—" She stopped. She got up, went to the shelf, came back with her ledger and a pen. "How far down are we talking?" 60, maybe 70 feet. The shaft he dug was 40. What does a well drill cost at that depth? $80, $100 if you hire a crew. "We have that." She was already writing. "We drill in March before Crow's Spring Drive. If we have a reliable secondary water source documented, it changes our entire risk conversation with the bank. It means the drought vulnerability, which is probably the single most legitimate concern Danforth has about our long-term viability, is addressable." She looked up. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" He looked slightly uncomfortable, the way he still did occasionally when she caught him holding something back. "It seemed like a long shot. A 40-year-old notation in my grandfather's handwriting. Everything is a long shot until you test it." She wrote a note at the bottom of the page, underlined it twice. "Tomorrow, at the meeting, if the water risk comes up, I'm going to mention the secondary source. I need you to be ready to back that up." He looked at her. "You want me to commit to it before we've drilled. I want you to say that you've been aware of the secondary water table and that drilling is planned for spring. That's true. We're planning it right now." A pause. He almost smiled. "That's a fine line." "Most useful truths are," she said. She went back to bed an hour later. She wasn't sure she slept, but when morning came, she got up and dressed and ate breakfast with the same steadiness she'd carried every other morning, and when Garrett brought the wagon around, she climbed up without ceremony, and they drove to Iron Ridge. The First Territorial Bank occupied the most solid building in Iron Ridge, 2 stories of dressed stone on the north end of the main street, with the bank's name carved into the lintel in letters meant to communicate permanence. Naomi had looked at this building every time she'd come to town and registered its position relative to Mercer's boarding house, which was half a block north, and the town council chambers, which shared a building with the sheriff's office on the cross street. The geography of power in a small town was not complicated once you understood it. Danforth's office was on the 2nd floor, up a narrow staircase that smelled of wood polish and old paper. His secretary, a young man who looked like he wanted to be somewhere else, showed them up and offered nothing in the way of warmth. Danforth was behind his desk when they came in, a heavy-set man in his mid-50s with a banker's careful stillness, the kind of man who'd learned to give away nothing in his expression because his expression was a professional tool. He had a file on his desk. Naomi noted the file's thickness with a single glance and registered that it was thicker than just their account records. Silas Mercer was sitting in the chair to the left of Danforth's desk. She hadn't expected that, and she let herself have 1 second of surprise before she filed it away. She kept walking, kept her face neutral, pulled out the chair across from Danforth and sat down. Garrett sat beside her. Mr. Mercer, she said pleasantly. I didn't know you'd be joining us. Mercer's expression was composed, but there was something satisfied underneath it. I have an interest in the financial stability of the business community in this valley, he said. The bank asked me to provide some context. Danforth cleared his throat. Mr. Mercer has been a client of this institution for 14 years and sits on our business advisory committee. His input on the regional commerce environment is standard practice, Naomi said. Danforth paused. Helpful context. She set her satchel on her lap and opened it. Of course. She removed the first ledger and placed it on the desk. Shall we begin? What followed was an hour and 20 minutes that Garrett would remember afterward as one of the most uncomfortable and strangest experiences of his adult life, though not for the reasons he'd anticipated. He'd expected to be afraid. He'd spent 24 hours braced for it, braced for the sensation of the bank closing in, the mortgage called, the land going. He'd lived with that fear for 2 years, and he knew its particular texture. But sitting in that chair watching his wife work, he found he wasn't afraid. He was something else entirely, something closer to witness, the experience of watching a person do what they were built to do with a precision that left almost no room for anything else. Danforth started with the operational concerns. The income stream was new, he said. It was dependent on contracts that could be canceled. The railroad project would complete and the railroad workers would leave. The cattle drive provisioning was seasonal. The overnight lodging was minimal. The core ranch operation, cattle, was still carrying debt. Naomi answered each point in sequence, without hurry. The railroad contract. She produced the renewal documentation, signed 2 weeks prior, extending through the full completion of the Northern Line, another 8 to 11 months. She produced a letter from Walsh expressing the company's satisfaction with the arrangement. She produced a second letter, this one from the Regional Provisioning Manager's office, confirming no outstanding complaints and the clean inspection report from November. The cattle drive provisioning, she laid out the trail circuit data. Crow's operation was not the only drive that passed through the territory. She had inquiries from 2 additional trail bosses for spring. She showed the letters. She showed the projected income, conservatively calculated at 70% of the potential contracts assuming some fell through. The debt position. She walked Danforth through the mortgage payment history, current on every payment since August, not a single default. The reserve account that had not existed in August and now held enough to cover 2 full mortgage payments if the ranch earned nothing for 2 months. Mercer interrupted twice. The first time was to question the sustainability of the food operation, whether it was dependent, he said carefully, on the continued participation of a single person whose commitment to the area was unproven. He didn't say woman. He didn't have to. Naomi said, the operation is managed by me and employs 3 additional local workers, Clara Beggs, her daughter Mabel, and a part-time hire we brought on in November. The systems, the contracts, the supplier relationships, and the client agreements are documented in these ledgers and are transferable to any competent manager. She turned a page. The business is not dependent on a person. It's dependent on a system. That's how any sustainable business operates. Danforth made a note. The second time Mercer interrupted was when Naomi raised the secondary water table. She did it cleanly, didn't overstate it, didn't present it as a certainty. She said that the ranch property contained a known secondary water source at depth, identified in original survey notes, and that drilling was planned for March. She said this changed the long-term drought risk profile, which she understood was a concern. Danforth looked up. Known to whom? To Mr. Lawson, who found the original notation in his grandfather's survey records. She gestured to Garrett. Garrett said without hesitation, I've been aware of it for several years. It's been a question of timing and capital. We'll have both in March. Mercer was looking at them with an expression Naomi couldn't entirely read, something between frustration and calculation. He'd come into this room with a story prepared, and the story required a particular version of the ranch and its people, and that version kept not matching what was actually in front of him. I'd like to ask, Mercer said, turning to Danforth with the ease of a man changing angles, about the source of the capital used to build this operation. The initial investment, where did it come from? Naomi looked at him. My savings, she said, from 14 years of work in Lincoln, Nebraska. She reached into the satchel and produced a document, a letter from a Lincoln bank confirming her account history and the withdrawal made prior to her departure. I came here with capital. Not a great deal, but enough to begin. The operation funded its own expansion from the third month onward. Danforth took the letter and read it. He read it more carefully than the situation technically required, which told her something about his state of mind. She let him read. She let the room be quiet for a moment. She'd learned a long time ago that silence in a negotiation was not a problem to be filled. It was a tool. Mercer filled it instead, which was what she'd expected. "The point," he said, with a shift in his tone that was almost imperceptible but not quite, "is that this is a new operation built on speculative contracts in a highly variable market. And the bank's exposure, Naomi said, still pleasant, still even, has decreased by approximately 30% in 6 months due to the reduction in arrears and the increase in reserve." She placed the final document on the desk, a single-page summary she'd prepared specifically for this moment, the ranch's financial position in August compared to its position now, set side by side in 2 clear columns. "That's not speculation, that's the record." Danforth looked at the page. Then he looked at Garrett. Then, and this was the moment that mattered, the moment she'd been working toward since October. He looked at Mercer. Mercer's face was composed, but the satisfaction that had been sitting underneath it when they'd walked in was gone. "I'd like to step out with my colleague for a few minutes," Danforth said. They waited in the hallway outside the office. Garrett stood with his back against the wall, and Naomi stood beside him, and neither of them said anything for a while. The secretary at the desk at the end of the hall was pointedly sorting papers. "You knew he'd be in there," Garrett said quietly. "Not an accusation, just a realization. I thought it was possible. You brought the Lincoln Bank letter. I've been carrying it since October." She shifted the satchel on her shoulder. "I didn't know which angle he'd use. That was one of the possibilities." Garrett looked at the closed door. "Danforth is an institutional man. He cares about how things look on paper." "Yes. And on paper we're a performing account with improving numbers and documented contracts." She looked down the hallway at nothing in particular. "Whether he approves the renewal depends on whether his relationship with Mercer is worth more to him than a clean book entry. I can't control that part." He heard the honesty in it, the one place where her preparation ran up against the limit of what she could document and prove. The human variable, the piece that lived outside the ledger. "If he doesn't approve it," Garrett said, "then we appeal to the regional office and we have 30 days to find alternative financing, and we use the reserve to buy that time." Her voice was steady. "We don't lose the ranch today, no matter what happens in that room." He looked at her. She was looking down the hall, the winter light from the window at the end making her face clear and composed and very still. He thought about August. He thought about the stagecoach and the crowd on the boardwalk and the sound of people laughing at her before she'd said a single word. And he thought about how he'd stood there with his hat in his hands, feeling humiliated on her behalf, and how she'd walked past all of it as if it were weather. He thought about all the things he hadn't understood that day and understood now. "Naomi," he said. She looked up. He didn't say the rest of it. He wasn't sure yet how to say the rest of it, but something in his expression must have communicated enough, because she looked at him for a moment with something in her face he hadn't seen before. Not the measured composure, not the professional steadiness, but something softer and less guarded, and briefly, entirely human. Then the office door opened, and Danforth's secretary told them Mr. Danforth was ready. The renewal was approved. Danforth announced it with the brisk efficiency of a man closing a file, his expression giving nothing away about what had happened in the room while they'd waited in the hall. The terms were extended for 12 months at the existing rate, with a review scheduled for the following January. He made no mention of Mercer. Mercer himself said nothing further. He sat in his chair with his hat on his knee and his face arranged into blankness. And when Danforth finished speaking and Garrett and Naomi stood to leave, Mercer stood too and walked out ahead of them without a word. In the hallway, his footsteps went down the staircase and out of earshot. Garrett signed the renewal documents. His hand was steady. The secretary witnessed it, and Danforth shook Garrett's hand and then, with a pause that was perhaps half a second long, which in a room like that constituted something, shook Naomi's as well. "Mrs. Lawson," he said, "your documentation was thorough." Thank you, Mr. Danforth. They went down the stairs and out into the January street. The cold hit them both, the specific dead cold of a plains January that had no interest in how the morning had gone. Naomi pulled her coat tighter, and they walked to the wagon, and she climbed up, and he climbed up, and he shook the reins, and they pulled out onto the main road. They were past the edge of town, the buildings dropping behind them, and the open road stretching ahead before either of them spoke. "He was right there in the room," Garrett said. The anger in his voice was quiet but present, the low, banked kind. Mercer, sitting in that chair like he owned the place. "He thought he did," she said. "The advisory committee, the bank? He's been building that for years." "Yes." She looked out at the road. "And it didn't work today because the numbers were better than his story about us." She paused. "But he's not done. Danforth approving the renewal embarrassed him, and he knows we know that. That makes him more dangerous, not less." Garrett's jaw was tight. "When does it end? When does he just... when the cost of continuing is higher than the cost of stopping?" She said it simply. "We're not there yet, but we're closer than we were this morning." The land went by on either side of them, brown and frozen and wide. Ahead, the road bent slightly north toward the ranch, toward the kitchen and the ledgers and the work that was always waiting. Garrett drove and Naomi sat beside him, and after a while, in the cold quiet of the January afternoon, he reached over without looking at her and put his hand over hers where it rested on the seat. She didn't move her hand away. She turned it over briefly and let her fingers settle against his. They didn't say anything else. The wagon moved steadily through the cold toward home, carrying two people who had just walked into an ambush with nothing but paperwork and walked back out with what they'd come for, and who were beginning, both of them, to understand something about each other that went well beyond the ledger. Silas Mercer had lost this round, but both of them knew without saying it that losing a round was not the same as being finished, and a man like Mercer, publicly humiliated in a room where he'd expected to win, was going to come back at them with everything he had left. The ranch was still standing. That was what mattered today. Tomorrow was its own problem. Mercer's next move came not as a frontal attack, but as a slow leak, the way water finds the weakness in a foundation. Patient, quiet, and working from directions you weren't watching. It started with the Homestead families. 3 families south of the ranch had been Saturday regulars since October. The Petersons, the Halversons, and a widow named Ruth Cady, who ran 40 acres alone and whose daughter sometimes helped Mabel in the kitchen on busy days. They were not wealthy people. They were the kind of people the frontier produced in abundance. Stubborn, land poor, proud in the specific way of those who had given up easier lives somewhere else to come out here and try to build something. Naomi had priced their standing orders honestly, had occasionally thrown in an extra loaf or a jar of preserves when she had surplus, and had asked nothing from them beyond the modest payment they'd agreed to. In the last week of January, 1 week after the bank meeting, none of them came on Saturday. Naomi noticed. She didn't say anything immediately. She waited 1 more week. When the second Saturday passed without the Petersons or the Halversons or Ruth Cady's wagon appearing in the yard, she sent word through Mabel, whose network of social knowledge extended into every corner of the surrounding territory the way only a sharp-eyed 16-year-olds could. Mabel came back 2 days later with the information delivered in her direct, no-frills way. Mr. Peterson told his neighbor that he heard the food from this ranch made a family sick, passed it on from Mercer's feed account manager, who mentioned it casual-like at the hardware store. Naomi set down what she was holding and looked at Mabel steadily. The same rumor from November. Similar. This time, it's not anonymous. It's attributed to a family that supposedly traveled through on the stage in December. Mabel paused. There's no family by that name on any stage manifest I could find out about. My mother's cousin works the stage depot. Clara, at the stove, said nothing, but her shoulders had gone tight. He's going after the local people, Garrett said that evening. He'd been quiet through supper, the kind of quiet that meant he was angry and working to keep it in a shape he could use. The railroad and the bank, those were institutional. This is personal. He's trying to take the neighbors. Yes, Naomi said. So we fight it. We don't fight rumors. We never fight rumors directly. She looked at him across the table. The moment you defend yourself against a rumor, you've given it the weight of a real accusation. You've made people think it's worth defending against. Then what do we do? Nothing? Not nothing. She folded her hands on the table. We make the truth louder than the lie, not by arguing, by showing. She looked at her ledger, though she didn't open it. The harvest feast. Garrett waited. We invite everyone, she said, not just our customers, not just the people who already know us. Everyone. The council members, the ranching families, the people in town who've only heard Mercer's version of what this ranch is. We cook for all of them. We open the property. We let people see it and taste it and decide for themselves. She looked up. You can't sustain a rumor about poisoned food against a room full of people eating that food and feeling fine. He was quiet for a moment. That's a lot of people to feed. Yes, and the cost is an investment. She said it firmly. The 3 families we've lost represent a small piece of income. The reputation we lose if Mercer gets this story established in the homestead community represents something much larger. We spend now to protect what we've built. Garrett looked at her. Then he said, When? 4 weeks. That gives us time to prepare and time to spread the word properly. She picked up her pen. And Garrett, you need to be the one who invites people, not me. You've been in this territory your whole life. These are your neighbors. They need to hear it from you. He understood what she was saying without her having to say more. She was plain spoken about her own position in this, which was part of what he'd come to respect most about her. She didn't pretend the prejudices around her didn't exist. She just figured out how to navigate them without losing ground. All right, he said. I'll start tomorrow. Tabams. He started with Lester, which was the right instinct. Lester had been at this ranch for 30 years and knew every family within a 20-mile radius by name, by history, by which ones were feuding with which others and why, and which ones would come to a thing if asked right, and which ones needed a different approach. He was not an enthusiastic man. He'd been careful with his enthusiasm since before Garrett was born, but he had a quality of reliability that people trusted in their bones. Tell me who we need, Garrett said, sitting with him on the bunkhouse steps in the cold February morning. Lester thought for a while. He thought the way he did everything without rushing it. The Halversons matter because Sigrid Halverson talks. Everyone within 5 miles knows what she thinks within a week. You get Sigrid, you get the Women's Network. He paused. The ranching men will follow if Ed Craster comes. Ed doesn't follow anyone, which is why people follow him. Craster hasn't spoken to me in 2 years, not since the boundary dispute. No, Lester said. So that one you're going to have to do yourself, and you're going to have to do it without your pride. He looked at Garrett the way he'd been looking at him since Garrett was 8 years old and had done something stubborn and regrettable. Your wife is right about this. The feast matters. But it only matters if the right people come, and the right people aren't going to come unless you ask them properly. Garrett drove to Ed Craster's ranch on a Wednesday. He went alone, without Naomi, because this was the kind of errand that had to be done between 2 men who had history, and bringing his wife would have made it something else. Craster met him at the fence line, a broad, weathered man in his 60s who'd built 3 ranches from nothing in his lifetime and had opinions about everything and the confidence of a man who'd been right often enough to trust his own judgment. The boundary dispute 2 years ago had been over a strip of land that turned out, when properly surveyed, to belong to neither of them, and both of them had wasted money on lawyers proving it. They stood at the fence for a moment without saying anything. Lawson, Craster said finally. Ed. Garrett put his hands in his coat pockets against the cold. I came to invite you and your family to a harvest feast at the ranch. First Saturday of March. My wife's cooking. He paused. I also came to say that the boundary business, I handled it badly. I should have come to you directly before I hired a lawyer. Craster looked at him. He looked at him for a long time, the evaluating look of a man who'd been in enough negotiations to know when one was genuine. Your wife, he said. She's the one who's been feeding the railroad crew. Among other things. Walsh's foreman mentioned her to my brother-in-law, who works supply on the Northern Line. Craster paused. Said the food was better than anything he'd had since his mother's table. Another pause. Mercer's been saying she's trouble. Mercer's been saying a lot of things. Yes, he has. Craster looked out across his land for a moment, then back. First Saturday of March. I'll bring my wife. Garrett drove home with the tightness in his chest that had been sitting there all morning, having eased somewhat. the particular relief of a difficult thing that turned out to be survivable. He told Naomi about the conversation that evening, leaving in the part about handling the boundary dispute badly, because she'd know if he'd edited it out. "You apologized to him," she said. "It was overdue." She looked at him for a moment with that look she had sometimes, not soft exactly, but present, like she was seeing him clearly, and the seeing was not unpleasant. "That took something," she said. "It took Lester telling me I needed to." He picked up his coffee cup. "I've been taking direction from you for 7 months. Taking it from Lester on top of that shouldn't be a stretch." She almost smiled. Not quite, but close. The preparation for the feast took 3 weeks, and was, Naomi would later reflect, the most demanding logistical challenge she'd faced since arriving at Iron Ridge, more complex in some ways than the bank meeting, because it required coordinating not just documentation but food, labor, space, and people, all of which had their own particular resistances. Clara threw herself into it with an energy that Naomi found both gratifying and occasionally exhausting, because Clara's enthusiasm expressed itself through an endless stream of suggestions that ranged from genuinely excellent to wildly impractical. Mabel was more useful as a filter. She'd adopted, without being asked, the role of evaluating her mother's ideas and sorting them into categories before they reached Naomi's attention. Roy turned out to have a previously undemonstrated talent for construction. He built 2 long serving tables from lumber they had in the barn, solid and level. And when Naomi looked at them and said they needed some kind of covering to look right, he disappeared for an afternoon and came back with a length of canvas he'd traded for at the hardware store. Dale helped him stretch it. The result was better than it had any right to be given that neither of them had done it before. Lester managed the outdoor arrangements, fire pits for warmth, a space cleared in the yard for people to gather, the practical matters of where the horses and wagons would go when people arrived. He did it without being asked and without consulting anyone, and when Garrett mentioned it to Naomi, she said, "He's been waiting for the ranch to be worth being proud of again. Let him do it the way he sees fit." The menu was Naomi's domain entirely, and she built it the way she built everything. From the ground up, nothing assumed, everything tested. She had Clara make 3 versions of the cornbread until she found the balance that worked best in large quantities. She developed a slow-roasted beef preparation that could feed 100 people without losing quality, using the cold cellar and the careful timing she'd been refining all winter. She made preserves and pickled vegetables and 2 kinds of pie, and she made them in quantities that seemed excessive until people started arriving and then seemed just barely adequate. The morning of the feast, she was up before 4. Garrett found her in the kitchen at 5, already in motion, the stove going strong and the first batches of bread already in. He stood in the doorway for a moment watching her work. The efficiency of it, the way she moved through the kitchen like she'd been born knowing exactly where everything should be, and felt something that was hard to name, a compound feeling that had been building since January, and that he'd been mostly ignoring because naming it would require him to do something about it. "You should sleep," she said without turning around. "I slept enough." He came in and poured coffee. "What do you need?" "In about 2 hours I'll need Roy and Dale to start the fire pits. Until then, just stay out from underfoot and let me work." He laughed, which had become easier. It came naturally now in a way it hadn't for most of the past 2 years. He went and did the morning chores and then sat on the porch in the cold and watched the sky go from black to the dark gray of early morning and then to the thin pale blue of a February dawn. And he thought about the ranch, about what it had been in August and what it was now and what it might be by summer. And he thought about his wife in the kitchen, who had arrived in a too large dress and been laughed at and had proceeded to save everything, methodically and without fanfare, as if failure had simply never been one of her available options. He thought about her hand in his, briefly, on the wagon seat coming back from the bank. He thought it was time to stop ignoring what that meant. People began arriving at noon. The Halversons came first. Sigrid and her husband and their 2 grown sons in their best wagon, Sigrid already looking at everything with the sharp-eyed interest of a woman who was going to have detailed opinions by the end of the afternoon. Naomi greeted them at the yard and put Sigrid directly into the center of the activity, asking her opinion on the table arrangement, because Sigrid was the kind of woman who engaged best when she felt consulted rather than observed. Sigrid rearranged 2 things, approved of everything else, and was thereafter an ally. The Crasters arrived 20 minutes later. Ed Craster shook Garrett's hand, and his wife, a small, quiet woman named Dora, walked straight to the serving tables and looked at the food with the expression of someone who had spent 40 years at a frontier table and knew what real cooking looked like. "You made all of this yourself?" Dora asked Naomi. "My kitchen team did. Clara Beggs and her daughter mostly." Dora picked up a piece of the cornbread and ate it. She chewed thoughtfully. "The rosemary," she said. "That's fresh?" "Dried, from the ranch's own stock. There's a wild stand along the south fence." Dora put another piece of cornbread on her plate without further comment, which was its own kind of review. By 2 in the afternoon, there were close to 90 people in the yard. The Peterson family came, and the Halversons' neighbors, and 2 council members whose attendance Naomi had secured through separate conversations Garrett had held in town during the preceding 2 weeks. Careful conversations, not about Mercer, not about anything contentious, just neighborly invitations from a man who'd been somewhat removed from the community for 2 years of financial crisis and was now finding his way back into it. Ruth Katie arrived alone, as she did everything, driving her own wagon with the competence of a woman who'd long since stopped waiting for assistance. She found Naomi near the serving tables and said, without preamble, "I should have come to ask you about the rumor directly instead of just staying home." "You didn't have reason to doubt what you heard," Naomi said. "I had 7 months of good bread from your kitchen." Ruth's voice was dry. "That was reason enough." She picked up a plate. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry, just eat." Ruth ate. She ate with the particular appreciation of a woman who cooked alone and rarely had someone else's cooking to compare it to. And when she was done, she went and talked to Sigrid Halverson, and the 2 of them stood together for an hour, and Naomi watched them from across the yard and understood that whatever they were discussing was useful. Walsh, the railroad foreman, came in the late afternoon with 3 of his crew. He was off schedule for the week, some problem with a supply delivery, and had heard about the feast from a ranch hand in the next town over. He shook Garrett's hand and looked around the yard at the gathered community and said, "Huh." The sound conveyed, in the efficient way of a man who didn't waste words, that he was impressed. "Your wife did this," he said to Garrett. "She organized it. The ranch did it." Walsh looked at him. "That's a good answer," he said, with the faintest suggestion of approval. What Naomi had known, what she'd been counting on, was that food did something words couldn't. You could argue with a story. You couldn't argue with a plate in front of you and hunger in your body and the evidence of your own experience. 90 people eating well on a February afternoon on a ranch they'd been told was failing, managed by a woman they'd been told was dangerous. Every bite was a small refutation, quiet and undeniable. She watched it happen across the afternoon, the gradual shift in the yard's atmosphere from the tentative politeness of people who weren't entirely sure they should be there to something warmer and less guarded. People stayed longer than she'd expected. Children ran between the tables. The Craster boys helped Roy move a bench when more room was needed. Dora Craster found Clara, and the 2 of them stood together talking with the ease of women who'd discovered they had 40 years of shared domestic experience to compare. Garrett moved through the crowd with a naturalness she hadn't seen in him before, relaxed in a way he wasn't inside the house, the social ease of a man on his own land among his own people, a quality she realized had been buried under 2 years of shame and financial fear, and was now resurfacing now that the fear had receded enough to give it room. She let him do it. She stayed near the kitchen, near the work, present but not central, because this particular afternoon was not supposed to be about her. It was supposed to be about the ranch, about the community, about Garrett reclaiming a place he'd never intended to lose. It was working. She could feel it working in the way that things she'd planned carefully sometimes did. Not perfectly, not without friction, but fundamentally in the right direction. Mercer was not there. She hadn't expected him to come, and he didn't, which told her something about his confidence. A man who felt secure in his position would have come and smiled and let the social occasion pass without meaning. Mercer stayed away because he understood what it meant, and he knew he couldn't control it. That understanding cost him. By 5 o'clock, the yard was starting to thin as families prepared for the drive home before dark. Naomi was in the kitchen with Clara and Mabel, organizing the cleanup, when Garrett came in. He looked, she noticed it immediately, different from the morning. Not lighter exactly, more settled, like a man who'd spent the day remembering who he was and found he still recognized himself. Ed Craster wants to talk about a joint purchase on the Millhaven cooperative contract, he said. His feed costs are worse than ours were. He asked if we'd consider pooling the order. Yes, she said. That's worth exploring. Two of the council members, Morrison and Hale, both asked about the stage lodging. Morrison's got a brother-in-law in the stage business in Kansas. I'll write to him this week. He leaned against the door frame and watched her for a moment. Clara and Mabel were moving around her, taking direction, the kitchen operating with the practiced flow of a unit that had been working together long enough to know each other's rhythms. There's something else, he said. She looked up. Sigrid Halverson. He paused. She told me she'd heard what Mercer's been saying about you, about us. She said, he stopped, not because he'd forgotten the words, but because saying them required something from him. She said she was sorry she'd let it sit in her head as long as she had without coming to see for herself. Naomi was quiet. Sigrid Halverson, he said, tells 12 families in this valley what she thinks. She told me personally, tonight, that what she thinks is that Iron Ridge Ranch is the best thing that's happened to this corner of the territory in 10 years. He looked at her steadily. She said she should have said that sooner. Naomi turned back to the counter and straightened a stack of plates that didn't need straightening. Good, she said. Her voice was level, but not quite as level as usual. Clara glanced at Mabel, and Mabel found something urgent to do in the pantry. Garrett crossed the kitchen and stood beside her. Not close enough to be intrusive, just present in the way he'd learned to be, the way that didn't demand anything but made space for whatever was there. I owe you something, he said quietly. You don't. I do. He wasn't going to be deflected. The day you arrived, I stood at the edge of that crowd and I let them laugh and I didn't say a word. I was embarrassed, not by you, by myself, if I'm honest, by the situation, by what they must have thought of me. But I let it land on you and I didn't stop it. She was still looking at the counter. I've been thinking about how to say this since October, he said. I keep getting it wrong in my head, so I'm just going to say it flat. You came here knowing exactly what you were walking into, and you built something extraordinary out of it anyway. You saved this ranch. You saved the people who depended on it. And I judged you in those first days for not being what I expected, which was the single stupidest thing I have done in my adult life. He paused. I'm sorry for it. She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that he wondered if he'd miscalculated the distance between them. Then she turned and looked at him. Her face was not the composed professional face, not the ledger face, but the one that appeared sometimes in unguarded moments, the one he'd seen briefly outside the bank. Real and a little tired and genuinely, specifically, his wife. You showed up to everything I asked, she said. You learned the numbers. You went to Craster and apologized. You drove me to that bank meeting and sat next to me and backed every word I said. She looked at him steadily. That counted, more than you probably know. It's the minimum, he said. Most people don't manage the minimum. She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, Go help Roy with the fire pits. I'll be done in here in an hour. He went. She watched him go and then turned back to the kitchen, and for once she let herself stand still for 30 seconds and just feel the full weight of the day. The people, the food, the things Sigrid Halverson had said, Garrett's voice in the kitchen just now, before she picked up her cloth and got back to work. The word spread the way she'd expected, along the cattle trails and the stage routes and the invisible thread of territory gossip, carried by every person who'd eaten at the feast and gone home to tell someone else about it. It moved faster than a rumor because it was specific. People could say, I was there, I ate the food, I talked to Garrett Lawson and his wife, and here is what I found. Testimony from people they knew and trusted, grounded in a direct experience that couldn't be edited or misquoted. By mid-March, 2 new business inquiries had come in. A ranching family further south who'd heard about the provisioning operation from Eben Crow and wanted to discuss a similar arrangement for their seasonal hired crew, and a small mining operation an hour's ride north who'd been struggling to feed their workers and had heard about the railroad contract through Walsh. Mercer's boarding house, meanwhile, had lost 3 of its regular commercial accounts. Not because anyone specifically boycotted it. Naomi had made no move in that direction and would not have. But commerce in a territory followed trust, and trust followed reputation, and reputation was being rebuilt at Iron Ridge and quietly eroding at Mercer's. Not because of anything done to him, but because of everything done without him. He understood this. She knew he understood it because he made one more move in March. A letter to the county land office raising questions about the water rights attached to the secondary well drilling, claiming a prior survey gave him an interest in the water table in that section of the valley. Naomi read the letter with the same composure she brought to all of his moves. Then she got her satchel and the county survey records she'd quietly obtained in February, on the same intuition that had led her to get the Lincoln Bank letter back in October, and she sat down and wrote a response that was 4 pages long, and cited 7 specific legal precedents, and concluded that the claim had no foundation in any recorded survey. She sent it to the county land office and a copy to a lawyer in the nearest large town she'd been corresponding with since November. The land office responded in 10 days. The claim was dismissed. She filed the response in her ledger and said nothing about it to Garrett until the evening, and when she told him, his face went through several things in quick succession: anger at Mercer, relief at the outcome, and then something else when he looked at her. "The survey records," he said. "You had those already." "I had them since February." "You knew he might try this." "I knew it was a possible angle. Water rights are the most contentious legal territory in a dry year." She turned a page. "So I made sure our position was documented before he got there." He looked at her across the table in the lamplight, and she could see him doing what he'd been doing more and more frequently in recent months. Not catching up to where she was, but understanding the path she'd taken to get there, following the logic backward through all its careful steps. "You've been 3 moves ahead of him this entire time," he said. She looked up. "Not always," she said honestly. "The Homestead families, I didn't anticipate how quickly he'd move there. That cost us 6 weeks. She closed the ledger. "But you try to be as far ahead as you can, and you accept that you'll miss some things." He shook his head slowly. Not in disbelief, save in something more like wonder, tempered by the particular honesty of a man who'd stopped lying to himself about things. "Naomi," he said, "when I put that advertisement in the paper, I was trying to solve a problem. I was trying to find someone who could keep house, help out, be a reasonable arrangement for 2 people who needed each other practically." He paused. "I had no, I know," she said. "Neither did I, entirely." She looked at him for a moment. "But here we are." "Here we are," he said. The lamp burned between them, and outside the March wind was finally carrying something other than winter in it. The first trace of something warmer, the land beginning to stir under its long, cold covering. The particular fragile announcement that spring was somewhere behind it. The ranch was not saved yet. There was still the spring drive, the well drilling, the new contracts to formalize, the year ahead of work that would either compound what they'd built or expose its weaknesses. Naomi knew all of this. She held it in her mind with the same clear-eyed practicality she held everything. But sitting across from Garrett in the warm kitchen, with the ledger closed for once and the evening quiet around them, she allowed herself something she didn't often allow. The simple acknowledgement that what they had built together in less than a year from very nearly nothing was real. It was not perfect. It had cracks and rough edges, and the memory of hard months and things said and unsaid between them that would take more time to resolve. But it was real, and it was theirs, and it was standing. For tonight, that was enough. The well came in on a Thursday in the 3rd week of March, 64 feet down, and the water that rose was clean and cold and so abundant that the drilling crew foreman stood at the edge of the shaft and shook his head slowly, the way men do when they're looking at something that renders previous suffering retroactively unnecessary. Garrett stood beside him and said nothing for a long time. Lester was there too, a few feet back, and when the water came up, he turned away and walked toward the barn at a pace that suggested he had something to attend to. Naomi had noticed over the months that Lester expressed strong feeling by finding somewhere else to be. She didn't follow him. She crouched at the shaft opening and looked down at the water and thought about Garrett's grandfather, who had drilled 40 feet and found the first sign of it and turned back because the cost was too high, and who had written a notation in a survey book and put that book in a box in an attic where it had sat for 4 decades while the ranch above it grew and struggled and nearly died of thirst. She thought about how much of the frontier's suffering came down to that same story. Knowledge that existed but wasn't acted on, solutions that were present but not reached, the terrible distance between what was possible and what people believed was possible. 64 feet, the foreman said. You've got enough water here to double your cattle operation and still irrigate a working crop field. I know, Naomi said. She said it quietly, and she meant it not as a boast but as something closer to grief. A grief for all the years this water had been sitting down here in the dark, while the ranch above ran dry. You couldn't recover those years. You couldn't undo the debt that had accumulated in their absence. You could only go forward with what you had now. She stood up and brushed the dirt from her hands and looked at Garrett. His face was complicated in the way it got sometimes, relief and sorrow occupying the same expression, the way they do when something good arrives too late to help the person who needed it most. His father had lost the ranch's margin during the drought years. His father had died still believing the land was failing. He didn't know, Garrett said, reading him. No, he didn't know. He worked this land for 30 years and it was right here the whole time. Yes, she paused. But you're here, and now you know. He looked at her for a moment. Then he turned back to the shaft and watched the water and let that sit. Spring arrived with the kind of urgency the plains delivered it. Not gently, not gradually, but all at once, like a door being thrown open. The kitchen garden that Naomi had put in the previous August was now in its second season, expanded to 3 times its original size with the addition of 2 hired hands specifically for the agricultural work. The south field, which Garrett had told her about on their wedding night, the one that flooded in March and stayed soft through April, had been managed precisely. The cattle kept off it until it firmed, and the result was a pasture in better condition than it had been in 4 years. Eben Crow's spring drive came through in late April, 61 men this time, and when the first wagon of provisions arrived at the staging point and the crew foreman lifted the covers, the sound that went through the assembled men was the same sound Walsh's railroad crew had made 8 months earlier. The specific, uncomplicated sound of people surprised by something genuinely good. Crow himself stood off to the side watching his crew eat, and when Naomi walked over, he said without preamble, "I've got a colleague, name of Sutherland, runs a drive out of the Southern Territory. He asked me to ask you if you'd take a contract for his fall circuit." "Tell him to write to me directly," she said. "I'll need his head count and schedule." Crow looked at her with that gruff, measuring look he had. "You know what you've built here, don't you?" She considered that for a moment. "I know what we've built," she said. "It's not finished yet." He made a sound that was as close to a laugh as Crow got, and went back to watching his crew. The mining operation contract had been finalized in April. 40 workers, 5 days a week, lunch delivered to the site. Claire's eldest son, 17 and strong, had been hired specifically for the delivery runs, and he took to the work with the reliability of a young man who understood that a regular wage was not something to be careless with. The stage lodging had expanded to 4 rooms after Morrison's council contact with the stage company came through, and the company agreed to designate Iron Ridge Ranch as an official rest and overnight stop on the territory circuit. 4 rooms wasn't a hotel, but it was consistent, and it was profitable, and it was documented in the ledger alongside everything else. By May, the ranch was running at a margin Naomi had projected as a best-case scenario the previous September, and she'd moved the projection up twice since. She sat with the numbers one evening in early May and checked them 4 times, not because she thought she'd made an error, but because the discipline of checking was how she'd gotten here in the first place, and she wasn't about to stop now. The mortgage, the debt that had been drowning the ranch when she arrived, the number Garrett had told her on their first drive home together, was down by 38%. At the current rate, without increasing revenue at all, it would be retired in full within 4 years. She wrote that number down, underlined it once. She didn't show it to Garrett that evening. She waited until Sunday morning, when the kitchen was quiet and they were sitting with coffee and the particular piece of a day without deliveries, and she set the ledger open in front of him. He looked at the figure. He looked at it for a long time. 4 years, he said. Conservatively. If Sutherland's fall contract comes through and the mining operation renews, which I think they will, less than 3. He put his hand on the page, flat, as if he needed to touch it to believe it was real. She understood that. She'd felt it herself, the strangeness of numbers that moved in the right direction after years of watching them move in only one. "My father," he said, and then stopped. "I know. He spent the last years of his life believing this land was a failure." His voice was steady, but it had something in it. He left it to me already half convinced it was a burden. That was what I inherited. Not just the debt, but the belief that the debt was inevitable. That the land just wasn't enough. Naomi looked at her coffee cup. The land was always enough, she said. It just needed someone to stop apologizing for it and start building on it. Garrett was quiet for a while. Outside, the May morning was doing what May mornings in the territory did. Bright and cool with the smell of green things coming. The kind of morning that made the frontier feel like a promise rather than a punishment. Naomi, he said. She looked up. I want to make you a co-owner. Legal, recorded, your name on the deed beside mine. He said it directly, the way he'd learned she preferred things said. Not because you've earned it, though you have, but because this is your ranch as much as it's mine, and that should be written down somewhere official so there's no question about it after I'm gone, or if something happens, or any reason. It should just be true on paper the way it's true in practice. She looked at him for a moment. The annual celebration is in June, she said. The territory gathering. Half the county comes. I know, I've been going since I was 6. I'd like you to do it there, publicly. She held his gaze. Not for my vanity, because people's memory of this ranch is still forming. They're deciding what it is and who built it. If it's in front of the whole community, if it's witnessed, it becomes part of the official story. It makes it harder to revise later. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she'd come to know well, the one that meant he was catching up to the logic and finding it sound. Then he said, You've been thinking about this for a while. Since February, she admitted. He almost smiled. Of course you have. Silas Mercer left the territory on the 14th of May. Naomi heard about it through Clara, who heard it from the hardware store owner, who'd seen Mercer loading a wagon at the boarding house on a Tuesday morning. The boarding house itself had been sold, quickly, quietly, to a couple from Colorado who'd been looking for a property in the territory and who had no particular attachment to the history of the building or the man who'd run it. There was no confrontation, no final scene, no moment of reckoning. He simply reached the calculation that men like him always eventually reach, that the cost of continuing in a losing position exceeded whatever satisfaction came from the fight, and he packed his things and left. Naomi received this information and felt nothing dramatic, not triumph, not satisfaction in the way she'd expected. What she felt was closer to the feeling after a long, difficult job is completed and you set down the tool and rest your hands. A quiet, functional relief. The absence of a weight that had been present for so long that its removal felt more like silence than celebration. She told Garrett that evening. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Good." And that was the extent of what either of them said about Silas Mercer. Some endings don't announce themselves. They just stop. The annual Frontier celebration fell on the second Saturday of June, which that year was clear and warm with a wind off the mountains that kept the heat from being oppressive. The gathering was held on the wide, flat ground at the edge of Iron Ridge, a tradition going back to the town's founding, a day when the whole territory came in from the outlying ranches and homesteads, and the distance between neighbors collapsed for one afternoon into something that felt briefly like community. There were booths and tables, and someone always brought a fiddle, and sometimes two. Children ran everywhere, as children do when the usual rules about how far from their parents they could get were loosened by the occasion. The ranching families gathered in their particular clusters, but the clusters mixed more than they had before. The Crasters with the Halversons, the homestead families with the ranch workers, the stage travelers who happened to be passing through and had stopped because there was clearly something happening. Naomi had brought food from the ranch kitchen. Of course she had. 2 wagon loads, dispatched by Clara and Mabel at 8 in the morning, set up on 3 tables near the center of the grounds. It wasn't an attempt to dominate the celebration. There was other food, other families who'd brought their contributions, but it was a presence, a visible, edible fact about what Iron Ridge Ranch had become. Garrett moved through the crowd with Naomi beside him, and the difference from the last time most of these people had seen them together, at the bank or at the feast, was that they moved like people who had stopped performing comfort and actually had it. Not effortlessly. There were still conversations that required navigation, still moments where old prejudices showed themselves in small ways. Ed Craster's eldest son looked at Naomi with the barely concealed skepticism of a 25-year-old man who thought his father talked about her too admiringly, and Naomi handled it by talking to him directly about cattle genetics for 10 minutes, until he forgot to be skeptical and started being interested. These things took energy. She spent the energy. Ruth Katie found her near the food tables around midday and stood beside her watching the crowd for a moment. "You're not leaving," Ruth said. It wasn't quite a question. "No," Naomi said. "When you first arrived, I'll be honest, I thought you'd be gone by winter. Most of the women who come out here for arrangements like yours are gone by winter." She paused. "The ones who stay are a different kind." "What kind is that?" Ruth thought about it. "The kind who decided something," she said finally, "before they arrived, like it was already chosen and the only thing left to do was the work." Naomi looked out at the crowd, at Garrett talking to Walsh and Craster on the far side of the grounds, at Clara's son carrying empty baskets back to the wagon with the easy stride of a young man who was proud of his work, at Mabel passing through the crowd with the confidence of a girl who'd spent a year learning that she was capable of more than she'd been told. "Something like that," she said. Ruth nodded once, as if that confirmed something. Then she went to get another plate of food, and Naomi let her go. The speech happened at 3 in the afternoon. Garrett hadn't told her exactly when or how he was going to do it. She'd told him what she wanted and left the manner of it to him, because it needed to be genuinely his rather than choreographed by her. She was standing near the food tables when she heard him call for attention, his voice carrying the way voices did in open air, and she turned and saw him standing on the back of the ranch wagon, hat in hand, the crowd turning toward him. He wasn't a natural orator. He'd never been. His public speech had the quality of a man who was going to say exactly what he meant and nothing beyond it, which was, she'd always thought, a better quality than eloquence. "Most of you know this has been a hard few years at Iron Ridge," he said. Not loudly. He didn't project beyond what the gathered crowd needed, which was everyone within 30 feet, and that turned out to be most of the celebration. "Some of you were probably carrying the place in your heads as a ranch that was going to fail. I won't pretend I didn't sometimes carry it that way myself." He paused. He looked at his hat. 8 months ago, a woman came out on the stage from Nebraska. I think a few of you remember the day. A small shift went through the crowd, some discomfort, some recognition, and from the direction of the Halversons, Sigrid's voice, half under her breath, "Lord, we do." Quiet laughter, the kind that carries self-awareness in it. She came in looking like what she was, a woman at the end of 3 days of hard travel, who'd packed everything she owned to come try to save a stranger's failing ranch. He looked up now, out at the crowd. "I stood at the edge of this very road, and I didn't say one word while people laughed at her. I want to say that in front of everyone here, because it needs to be part of the record. I failed her that day, and I knew it, and I did nothing about it." The crowd was quiet. Not uncomfortable quiet, attentive quiet. The way people go quiet when they recognize that something real is being said. What she did with that ranch in 8 months, I'm not going to stand here and list it because the numbers would take an hour. And some of you already know them from doing business with us. What I'm going to say is that the ranch is not failing. The ranch is not failing, and the reason it is not failing is the woman I married. He looked across the crowd to where Naomi was standing. Naomi Lawson saved that property. She saved the people who worked on it. She saved, frankly, my ability to look at myself in a mirror. And today I am registering in front of this community that she is the equal co-owner of Iron Ridge Ranch. Her name beside mine on the deed, her authority over the operation equal to mine in every respect, and that is how it will remain. Naomi had known it was coming. She'd planned it, in the way she planned things. She'd thought she was prepared for it. She was not, as it turned out, entirely prepared for it. Not for the sound that came from the crowd, not polite applause, but the real kind. The kind that starts before people decide to do it. The involuntary kind that comes from genuine feeling. Not for Sigrid Halverson, who started it with both hands. Not for Walsh, who put 2 fingers in his mouth and whistled, which was not a polite sound and was therefore the best possible sound. Not for Dora Craster, who was crying with the uncomplicated openness of a woman who had lived long enough to know that justice was not guaranteed and recognized it when it appeared. Not for Mabel, standing 20 feet away, who looked at Naomi with an expression of fierce, uncomplicated pride that Naomi had to look away from because it was too direct to hold. Not for Lester, who was standing to the side, not applauding. He wasn't a man who applauded, but standing with his arms at his sides and his face carrying the specific peace of a man who'd been waiting a long time for something to be right and had finally seen it. Garrett climbed down from the wagon and came through the crowd to her. He was not a demonstrative man. They had not been demonstrative people with each other, not publicly, not yet. But he walked to her and took her hand and held it, in front of everyone, in the clear June afternoon. She let him. She held on. "You all right?" he said quietly. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice was almost steady. "You're not fine." "I'm fine," she said again, and he had the good sense not to argue the point. The celebration continued into the evening. Lanterns were lit as the sun went down, and the fiddle player was joined by two others, and the dancing that started in one corner of the ground spread until it occupied most of the flat area, the kind of dancing that didn't require skill or formal training, just the willingness to move. Naomi danced once with Garrett, who moved with the particular careful attention of a man who did not entirely trust his own feet but was willing to try. He stepped on hers twice. She stepped on his once. Neither of them said anything about it, which felt like its own kind of progress. They drove home under a sky full of stars, the wagon moving through the warm dark. The ranch rode familiar now in a way it hadn't been 8 months ago when she'd first traveled it. She knew every bend, every rut, every place where the road lifted slightly before dropping back down. She knew the sounds the land made at night and what they meant, and which ones were worth attending to. She knew this place the way she'd intended to know it, the way she'd planned to know it before she ever arrived. Garrett drove and she sat beside him, and the horses moved steadily through the dark, and neither of them felt the need to fill the quiet with anything. They'd gotten past the stage where silence between them required management. That happened somewhere around November, she thought, or possibly earlier. She couldn't mark the exact moment, which was perhaps how you knew it was real. "Are you happy?" he asked. Not sentimentally. The way he asked things, direct and a little uncertain, like a man checking a calculation. She thought about it honestly, because he deserved an honest answer, and because she wasn't given to answering things she hadn't thought about. "I'm not sure happy is the right word," she said. "I'm satisfied, in a way I haven't been before." She looked out at the passing dark. There's something about building something real, something that actually works, that actually helps people, that wasn't there before you put it together. I've wanted that since I was young and watching my aunt run that boarding house kitchen in Lincoln. I wanted to do something at scale, something that mattered beyond just getting through the day. She paused. "This is that." "It's more than that," he said. "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "Are you happy?" He thought about it with the same seriousness she'd given it. "I'm not ashamed anymore," he said. "That sounds like a small thing. It isn't." She understood exactly what he meant. She'd met him when the shame was the primary color of his life. The shame of inherited debt, of perceived failure, of standing at the edge of a crowd and not defending his own wife. She knew what it had taken from him and what it had cost, and she knew that the absence of it was not a small thing at all. "No," she said, "it isn't." They pulled into the ranch yard, the house dark and waiting, the smell of the horses and the night air and the green spring growth all present at once. Garrett unhitched the horses and she carried the empty baskets into the kitchen. And then they stood in the kitchen for a moment in the lamp they'd left burning low, the familiar room, the table with its ledgers, the shelf with its record of everything that had been built here. "The deed," she said. "When will it be official?" "I filed the paperwork with the county office last week, pending the clerk's processing, which Morrison said was 2 to 3 weeks. She looked at him. "You filed it last week." "I wanted it to be real before I said it in public." He set his hat on the hook by the door. Seemed like the honest order of operations. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "That was the right call." He almost smiled. "I learned from someone, Bob. There is something the frontier teaches you, if you stay long enough to learn it. Something it teaches in the particular hard school of failed crops and dry wells and debt that compounds while you sleep. It teaches you the distance between what you deserve and what you get. Those are not the same country, and the people who survive out here are mostly the ones who figure that out early enough to stop waiting for fairness and start building anyway. Naomi Whitaker had figured it out in a boarding house kitchen in Lincoln, Nebraska, when she was 14 years old, and watching her aunt manage 20 people's hunger with $40 and a wood stove that had a faulty flue. She'd watched her aunt not complain, not perform suffering, not wait for someone to come and fix the stove. She'd watched her aunt work the problem with what she had, methodically, without drama, until the problem was smaller than she was. She'd been trying to do that since. The thing nobody tells you about building something from nothing is how lonely the early part is. Not lonely in the way of having no people around. There were always people. Lonely in the specific way of being the only person in the room who could see what you were working toward, while everyone else saw only what was in front of them. Lonely in the way of being laughed at on a stagecoach platform and understanding that the laughter was not about you but about the limits of what other people could imagine, and choosing not to waste energy correcting them when you could spend that energy building instead. It is a discipline, that choice. It requires giving up the satisfaction of being understood in the moment in exchange for the slower, more durable satisfaction of being proven right over time. Most people can't make that trade. Most people need the validation too much, and there is nothing wrong with that. It is a human need and a real one. But it does mean that the work of the world tends to fall to the ones who can go without it long enough to finish something. Naomi had gone without it for a long time. She had it now. She had it in Garrett's voice at the celebration, and Sigrid Halverson's hands, and Walsh's whistle, and Mabel's fierce young pride, and Lester standing with his arms at his sides, letting the moment be what it was. She had it in 4 rooms of a ranch house that were never empty on weekends, and in a kitchen that fed 100 people a day, and in a ledger full of numbers moving steadily in the right direction. She had it in a man who had put her name on a deed before he said it out loud, because he wanted the truth to be real before it was witnessed. That last one, she hadn't planned. There is something the frontier also teaches you about other people, if you're paying attention, that most of them are doing the best they can with what they were given and what they were told, and that what they were told was often wrong, and that the wrongness is usually not malice but limitation. The people who'd laughed at her on that stagecoach platform were not bad people. They were people who had learned to see the world a certain way and hadn't yet had a reason to look again. Garrett had been one of them. He'd had the decency to know it and the character to change it, which was all you could ever ask of anyone in the end. Silas Mercer had not been able to do that. He'd seen something growing that he couldn't control, and he'd tried to stop it the way insecure people always try to stop things, by pulling them down rather than building himself up. There was no pleasure in his defeat because there had never been anything personal in the fight. He'd been an obstacle. Obstacles either give way or they don't, and when they do, you go forward, and that's the end of it. The ranch stood. The kitchen ran. The well gave clean, cold water 64 feet down, where Garrett's grandfather had stopped 40 years too soon. Some things take longer than they should. That is true of wells and of people both. The only question worth asking is whether, when you finally reach the water, you have the sense to stop mourning the delay and start drinking. In the last light of that June evening, when the celebration had ended and the fires had burned low and the territory had gone quiet in the way it went quiet on summer nights, that specific vast silence of open land under stars, Naomi stood at the kitchen window of Iron Ridge Ranch and looked out at the yard. The garden was growing, the second well was producing. The east wing had 4 rooms with clean white curtains, and 2 of them would have guests tomorrow morning who'd need breakfast. The ledger on the table behind her was full, every column current, every number honest. In the distance, the mountains sat blue-black against the sky the way they always had, indifferent to the small human dramas played out below them, entirely unmoved by failure or success or the 10,000 private negotiations between a person and the life they'd chosen. Garrett came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He looked out at the same yard, the same dark, the same mountains. After a while, she said, "We should get the summer contracts documented before Crow's people arrive next month." "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow is Sunday." "Monday, then." She was quiet for a moment. "Monday," she agreed. His hand found hers at her side, and she let it, and they stood at the window of the ranch that was theirs, both of them, in writing, in practice, and the long, complicated truth of a year that had started with a stagecoach platform and a crowd that laughed, and a woman who was already, even then, 3 moves ahead. The frontier didn't care about any of it. It never did. The land simply waited, the way it had always waited, for the people willing to stop being afraid of it long enough to build something worth keeping. They had built something worth keeping. That was enough. That was, in the end,